There we go. I believe we are on now. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brittany Aronson, and I am an assistant professor of sociocultural studies and education at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio.
Hi, I'm Mildred Boveda, and I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I have a long title. It's Assistant Professor of Cultural and Linguistic Diversity for Exceptional Learners. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started and just share a little bit about how Brittany and I came together. Actually, you have some insight about that in the introduction of that piece, but some of the background information that you wouldn't have is the fact that we met because we have a mutual friend from the high school that I went to was North Miami Senior High School, where the Kinsey shooting happened. Her friend, this scholar, actually, she's at New Hampshire. She went to college with her. I went to high school with her, and so we were just Facebook friends through that mutual acquaintance. And there was this heated discussion about what happened, and we both started engaging with the conversation. And Brittany was in town, and she asked us to go to a coffee shop and talk about what's happening in South Florida, specifically with this 2016 shooting. And then that's how we got started with this and our future projects.
So it's important, given the context of this class and what we're here to talk to you today about with ethics and research, to think about our social identities. So I identify as racially white and ethnically Latina. And it's not something that I have always identified as. And over the last few years, as I've continued to unpack and understand more about my Colombian side, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, did I realize that it was something that was really important for me to continue to work through. But nevertheless, I've always identified racially as white and have received white privilege. So that's a really important part of the way I think about the work that I do. Growing up in South Florida, I was taught really to not identify with my Latina side. So only in the past couple years, as I've lived in different places, Tennessee and Ohio in particular, have I begun to really analyze and think about, well, why is that? And so geography is a really important part, not only to our own identities and how we talk about ourselves, but obviously that showed up in our paper as well. So just I want to make sure that when we're talking here today about the ethical considerations of doing this research, that part for me is owning and naming the white privilege that I know that I've received in my life.
Yeah, and I just want to ask you something real quick. You said growing up in South Florida, you were encouraged to not self-identify as Latina by South Floridians or by your family. Can you clarify
Yeah,
that?
great question. It was definitely a part of my family, like definitely pushing away that side of my mother speaking and my grandmother speaking Spanish and that not being a part of who I was. But it would depend on the spaces I was in. So I learned certain friends I'd be like La Gringa, and then other friends I would be identified as Hispanic. So I think that a lot of that stuff I just ignored and just was like, I'm just white, and then moved on. So yeah.
So for me in South Florida, I grew up very much clear and very, very no confusion about the fact that I was a Black girl. But when people would ask me, like, where are you from, or like, what are you? That was a typical question growing up. I would say Dominican, because in South Florida, it's understood that you can be white with blonde hair and be Dominican, or you could be Black with curly or coiled hair and be Dominican. So in South Florida, there's a understanding of like the great variety of racial or colors and ethnic groups within Latin America. And now I'm in Arizona, like I mentioned earlier, and that's not the case at all. My daughter and I both, we often are assumed to not speak Spanish, or my daughter talks about how sometimes her Black girlfriends are confused that she can speak Spanish, and then her Mexican girlfriends wonder why she's always hanging out with some Black girls. So that's not something that was an issue in South Florida. In South Florida, I lived in a Caribbean, African American mixture of community. And, when I said I was Dominican, that was good enough. When I moved away from South Florida, when I went to college, I had a choice of engaging Black or Latino groups, and I engaged both because I was always both. And I found myself far more comfortable and more accepted and more honored in predominantly Black spaces. And so I started, when people would ask me about my identity, I started moving away from this Dominican identity. By the way, I was born in the United States. So me calling myself Dominican is a very transnational concept because I was a US citizen identifying not as an American, but as a Dominican family's close ties to the island. Again, something that was very common in South Florida. And so, but as I moved away from South Florida, and I was seeing how much I relied on the Black community, Black understandings, and then in my research, Black feminist epistemology, you know, I just started saying I'm either Afro Latina or I'm Black or I'm a Black Latina. So that's my captures it pretty much. And in fact, Brittany didn't really start self-identifying as ethnically Latina until recently.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
only in the past couple years. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say growing up, I would say I was Black when necessary. It just wasn't. It didn't seem it didn't seem that necessary to discuss. And I've always acknowledged that I was Latina. So in terms of the motivations behind writing the article, so for me, the post that I put that caught Brittany's attention, I was really frustrated with what happened. First of all, I'm from that part of the city. I didn't grow up in North Miami. I was in a magnet school, but I was familiar with the community because I went to high school there. And I was just really aggravated by the way the police were talking about this person with a disability. They were calling him white, which I was just like, when he clearly didn't seem to be white. So he was emphasizing how he was white and how he had a disability. And because of that, it's okay that he was shot instead of the Black man who was actually, that he was supposed to be the target. That's what he was saying. The target wasn't the Black man, it was this white, supposedly white, disabled man. And it was very disingenuous coming from this context. And it was very clear that he was talking to a national audience, that he wasn't just talking to us in South Florida, that he was very concerned about how the rhetoric and the discussion and the social media attention to Black Lives Matter, he didn't want that to be influenced. He didn't want that to frame what happened with this Latino/Hispanic officer shooting a Black man and supposedly targeting this person with a disability. And so I was just really, I guess I had three motivations. One, I was disgusted with the farce, you know. Secondly, I was also a bit frustrated about how it was a very Black white conversation that people were having outside of South Florida about what happened, meaning, you know, like Black and white people when we have other identities in the United States besides, you know, African Americans and white. And that was kind of getting lost. And also this idea that it's okay to shoot a person with a disability. You know, the anti-Blackness is something that is taboo. Like even though it obviously is the reason why this man was shot, but it's a taboo thing. It's not something people want to admit to. But it was okay for the police officer to admit to a person with the disabilities being, you know, the target of police fire. And then finally, just like kind of having a conversation outside of the traditional like Black, white, disabled, not disabled. It's far more complex. And I was just noticing how so many of the people who were killed and were the hashtags of Black Lives Matter also had disabilities, and that was under discussed. So those were like my personal major motivators. Brittany?
And like what Mildred said, I had noticed as well the way that the conversations, when we were paying attention to the discourses of how when the police chief was like, "Oh, we didn't mean to shoot Kinsey. We meant to shoot Rio Soto," and like thinking about the ways that that discourse was really uh, really problematic and it was really concerning. So I had been involved living here in Cincinnati in Ohio in our Black Lives Matter chapter here, now known as the Mass Action for Black Lives. But I had been spending the summer in Florida that year, and there was several other shootings that had happened prior to this event. So um, there was a lot going on, and for me, I didn't have what I would call like my comrade community to try to make sense of everything that had been happening. So when I saw Mildred's post and we started talking about this, it felt almost like writing became a way to try to make sense of what was going on. And then in particular, something that I've learned, especially working with the Black Lives Matter chapter here in Ohio, is just how much everything that's happening in broader society bleeds into classrooms. And as someone who prepares future teachers, this is really, really concerning to me. And wanting to think about how this had impact in the ways, particularly the ways that anti-Blackness operates in schools, in the school to prison pipeline.
Yes, so I was at that point, I was the president of, or no, I was, now I'm the president of this organization that is for special educators of color or those who work with people with disabilities who are from um, personal for me. He was this black man who was shot because he was trying to get his somebody who he was responsible for back into this space, a safer space. I mean, that could have been me. There's been many times where I had to chase after a student with autism when I was in the K through 12 classroom, or many of my colleagues who are still in K through 12 and are not in the academy, they're people of color and they're working with um, with students like Rio Soto who have multiple identities and multiple ways that they're marked different or marked as a problem in our society. So it was very personal. It was very personal. I was like, that could have been me easily, or that could have been another colleague of mine. And we talked about it. We actually had like right away, we did um, a newsletter article. It was brief. And then we built from that when the special call came into play. But Brittany and I have spent a lot of time talking about our respective racial and ethnic identities and how much that matters in the work that we're doing. I was really confused, like with why she self-identifies so much as being white, when to me, like I was just like, yeah, you're white and you're also something else. It's like I'm black and Dominican and I'm black and Latina. And I'm just like, you're really emphasizing being white when you're far more than that. And so both with this project, I was constantly asking, like, what's the source of this? And, and that um, she explained to me that she wanted to acknowledge her privilege. But just like we were identifying in this particular piece that society was encouraging us to erase, for example, the disability identities of many of the people who are victims of excessive police force, or how they erased for convenience sake. They were trying to erase Rio Soto's Hispanics, Latino identity in order to fit a narrative. Like, what's going on with this erasure of your, to me, obviously, Latino ways of being and understanding the world. So identity was a huge part of and continues to be a huge part of our role as collaborators, as researchers who have collected data together, and as just general citizens who care about improving both our schools and our general community.
Yeah,
Or
and
a greater.
so in thinking about these various subjectivities, as Mildred is saying, for me, working through what's happening, what had happened in this case with Charles Kinsey, also opened up questions about the ways that I identify. So it became like a continued growth and learning space. And so we were able to both, well, as we continue to talk through, it really helped me to think about my own upbringing and how that influenced me, and then the ways that whiteness is always permeating, and it's not just about pigmentation of skin, but it's also ideology and the way it takes over your ways of knowing and being. So that's something that I've continued to move into the work that I do now, and as well as a lot of the work that Mildred and I continue to do with one another, especially because we work in two very different disciplines. Even though they're very similar, they're very different.
Yeah, and I think it's very important for you to think of how your discipline shapes how you even talk about identity. And this is something that both of us have to constantly think about, because in my field, when we say the word inclusion, we're thinking about students with disabilities, period, right? And we do a privileging of certain identities or certain types of diversities in my field. And that shapes a lot of times the way I even talk about some of these issues versus, let's say, like bilingual educators. Like there's a emphasis not on English language learning, but the fact that people have multiple linguistic experiences. Well, in my field, we barely ever say bilingual education. So then a lot of times we, not only is it our personal opinions or our personal identities that we're navigating, we're also talking about, we also talk with each other. And I explained to her, like, for example, if you publish or submit something for a special education journal, I explained to her things that are given in your space are not talked about at all in my space. And she's seen with reviewers giving us feedback. Like, I understand my field and like the learning curve when it comes to these topics. And so many times she's like, oh, that's fascinating, that this is such a new concept within your field. And similarly, she's encouraged me to see how um, how the insights that we have in special education matter in other spaces besides just special education discourse.
Okay, so the next thing that we're going to address is thinking about ethical issues within our research. Again, I know the point of where you are in your unit right now. So the first thing to say is that there is always going to be an ethical issue when you are using someone else's tragedy as a topic to write about. Building a career off of someone's suffering. That's a really difficult tension, and something that Mildred and I really worked through and continue to work through, because there's not necessarily one right answer to this. And thinking about how do we take up these conversations, and what are we doing with them. So there's always that tension between the authenticity of the work you're doing, with the way the academy works. Like for us as tenure track professors, we're expected to publish, and we want to write about things that matter. But we have to consider also the ethical considerations of when we do take up this type of work that involves an incident such as Charles Kinsey being shot.
Yeah, for this particular piece, we discussed whether we wanted to contact the people involved. Like that was a real discussion. I'm like, I remember saying, well, this doesn't feels kind of funny, us getting a publication too, including if you think about the newsletter as well, like off of these folks and talking about them, and not even, they don't even know who we are. And then we thought about that, like whether it was necessary, and really what we were analyzing was not the validity of their stories, or we weren't collecting, we weren't interviewing them. We were, in our piece, we were talking about the conversations that were public conversations about them. And so that helped me, like having that, talking through with Brittany about that, helped me feel like, okay, this is not us um, being exploitative or taking advantage of what's been publicized, but us really critiquing and examining the way that we're talking about these issues. And so those are the types of questions that you can consider when you're feeling kind of funny about certain topics. So for me, I am constantly thinking, writing, struggling, grappling with ethics in higher ed.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, and historically, we women have been completely shut out of the academy until very recently. So, like, for years and years and years, it's men that have been um, the canon, and even now, like, often I'm constantly reminding myself, okay, am I citing too many men in my theoretical framing? So there's one. So that's just as women, as as a woman, I'm thinking, you know, and are we including our authentic experiences and ways of thinking about this in our conversations? And then as people of color, we were not only were we systematically shut out and excluded from higher ed and from the research endeavor, we were researched on. And there's serious distrust with, I'm now in Arizona where there's a large indigenous community in the East Coast with African in the South with, Tuskegee and for example, Fannie Lou Hamer, she was in the name of science, she was they gave her a hysterectomy without her acknowledgement. And so knowing that that is baked into the academy, it is foundational to this building that I'm sitting in right now. I am constantly questioning myself and checking myself to make sure that I am not inadvertently, in the name of justice, in the name of
Right.
advocacy, just continuing on this new way. I mean, not the old way, the exploitative way, the westernized colonizing ways, the anti-black ways of the academy. And so, I know not only think about that in terms of like white people. I can talk about white people, doing it very easily, but I'm also I'm actually sometimes even harsher on myself and people of color who claim to be from a minoritized community and many times are just building their career off of their community's um, challenges.
So that might lead Mildred into us each leaving with some advice for novice researchers regarding research populations.
So I have an upcoming piece coming out probably by the end of this year in the Urban Review that I wrote with a colleague. Uh, and basically, the way we came together was I was so upset with how um, this very famous, beloved, wonderful, everybody thinks she's so great person was talking about Dominicans. And and then I was started digging into her, like, okay, what gave her the authority? She wasn't Dominican. She comes from a minoritized group, but she's not Dominican. What gave her the authority besides her being an academic to talk about this community? um it was very painful because people were posting and reposting and reposting it, and I'm like, who gave her permission? And so um this woman was from India, and so for a while I was very, as a black person, I mentioned earlier, as a black person, and this is something that comes up in our piece, anti-blackness is such a huge um barrier in our society, especially for Black folks, right? And so, even though I identify with an immigrant communities and I identify with Latinos and whatever, I'm always safest within Black communities. I'm always fully myself, fully comfortable when I'm with other Black people in the United States. And so, for me, what that highlighted was my distrust for sometimes non-Black people of color, like Brittany. You know what I mean? She didn't even acknowledge that she was a person of color, which was even more more confusing to me because I'm like, wow, whiteness is a hell of a drug. You know what I mean? Like, wow. And these people are hooked to it. And so working with this piece with this woman who was from the same community as this other scholar who was making these very deficit claims about Dominicans, we worked through some guidelines about what is appropriate when we are asked to give insights about minoritized groups that we're not a part of. And for example, another great example for me would be the disability community. I'm not disabled. I'm not disabled. My children don't have disabilities that are under IDEA. And a lot of times I need to check myself when I'm advocating on behalf of people with disabilities. Am I including the voice of people? Am I citing folks with disabilities? Like, what makes me the final judge and jury on this community? So those are things to consider when you are a person who comes from a minoritized communities, when you're talking about race and these issues. We're not exempt from ethical ethically exploitative dynamics. Not at all. In fact, a lot of times we are encouraged the most to do these kind of damaging and hurtful things.
And what I'd like to close with in terms of thinking about advice about ethical research. So I continue to do most of my work is working with future teachers, and I continue to do this research with the predominantly white future teachers that I work with. Because I identify racially as white, and I've gone through this process of understanding whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy. I do find that that's something that's useful when I'm thinking about the many teachers that I'm helping to prepare to go out into communities, many of which are black and brown. And I currently am working in a high school right now. It's a pretty much all black high school with high school students. And I love being in those spaces. I love learning with the students and I love them teaching me. But that's not the community that I feel from my ethical stance that I need to be doing research on. So naturally, there's a connection because I'm talking about preparing teachers to be in these spaces. But I don't feel, for me, I've made that choice that that's not who I need to be doing the work with. Until the time comes that I'm asked to do something, and that's always still a tension for me. Working in Black Lives Matter, there was a research project that came up, and I was asked to write this grant. I was asked to do this research. I haven't done anything with it. It's not something I'm trying to publish on, but I try to think about the balance between my own authenticity in terms of what I think is how I can continue to be my true self and to continue to do, I don't want to do more harm. So like how to do less harm. So I think there's power dynamics when you're working in inside or outsider spaces. Not just that, as Mildred just said, there's power dynamics when you're working in a quote unquote inside space. But that's just something that I think you have to constantly be aware of and constantly be grappling. And I wouldn't say there's any one right or wrong way, but I think that we need to always have that in the forefront of our minds when doing this work. That's what I'd like to leave you with. Mildred, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just I was thinking about the idea of research on, which is we often use that phrase. I mean, think about that phrase, research on someone. You're on someone or on something. And often I use research with because I like to co-construct knowledge. That's my orientation, or research about, and also just the word data. I like to look at the etymologies of words, and data is something that's given. And a lot of times we talk about data as something that's taken, that we collect data, that we gather data. But if you look at the etymology of the word data, it's something it's a given, something that someone's gifting you, and you got to honor that. As researchers, I'm constantly trying to honor the fact that my participants do not have to share what they're sharing with me, and in fact, like Brittany said, she doesn't have to collect data or write about everything that she's engaged in as a teacher, educator, or as an academic. It doesn't all need to be shared. It doesn't. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for letting us talk to you today. And if you have any questions, Dr. Hill can email us and we'll try to get back with by the time you have your next class.
Great.
Okay. Till next time. Bye.